April 25, 1951, 6:30 in the morning, a column of British Centurion tanks rolled south down Route 11 in Korea, and the hills on either side erupted with Chinese soldiers. According to unit accounts and veteran testimony, masses of infantry poured down the slopes, swarming onto the tank hulls, trying to pry open hatches with bayonets and attach explosive charges to the armour. The British response was to turn their turrets toward each other and sweep the enemy soldiers off friendly tanks with machine gun fire. When those Centurions finally reached friendly lines, veteran accounts describe the tanks bearing the brutal signs of close fighting, wreckage, body litter, and the scars of a desperate morning struggle. 7 tanks, a third of the entire squadron, had been knocked out in under 3 hours according to Regimental Histories and the QRH Museum's records. But the tanks had done something that should have been impossible. They had punched through a 4-mile gauntlet of 27,000 Chinese soldiers and brought most of the 29th Infantry Brigade out alive. The Centurion Mark III had arrived in Korea with a reputation as an unproven post-war experiment. It left as the most capable tank in the entire theatre, and the template for every main battle tank that followed. The problem facing British tank designers in 1942 was simple. British tanks were dying. The Crusader, Cavalier and Covenanter cruiser tanks had been plagued by mechanical failures and hopelessly undergunned against German armour. When a Crusader with its 40mm gun met a Panzer IV with 75mm frontal armour, the result was predictable. British crews called them coffins on tracks. The doctrine itself was flawed. Britain had split its armoured forces between slow, heavily armoured infantry tanks designed to support foot soldiers, and fast, lightly armoured cruiser tanks designed for exploitation and pursuit. Neither type could do the other's job. Infantry tanks like the Matilda and Churchill were too slow to exploit breakthroughs. Cruiser tanks like the Crusader were too fragile to slug it out with German panzers. The Germans had solved this problem years earlier with their Panzer IV, a single medium tank design that balanced firepower, protection, and mobility. The requirement that emerged in 1943 called for something new, a universal tank combining infantry tank protection with cruiser tank mobility. The specification demanded a 17-pounder gun, the same weapon that had finally given British forces a chance against Tigers and Panthers. It demanded armour that could resist the German 88 at combat ranges, and it demanded reliability, because the best gun and armour in the world meant nothing if the tank broke down before reaching the battlefield. The first 6 Centurion prototypes reached Belgium in May 1945, literally days after VE Day, too late for combat. The Mark I weighed roughly 40 tons and carried 76mm of Glacis armour. The Mark II, entering service in December 1946, increased the hull Glacis to 118mm, but the Mark III, which entered production in 1948, represented the transformation that mattered. The critical change was the gun. The Ordnance QF 20-pounder replaced the 17-pounder, and the difference in performance was dramatic. According to Royal Armoured Corps trials data, the 20-pounder firing APDS ammunition achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,465 metres per second. That translated to penetration of 330mm of rolled homogeneous armour at 1,000 yards. To put that in context, the German 88mm KWK-36, the gun that had terrorised Allied tankers throughout the war, could penetrate roughly 165mm at the same range. The 20-pounder delivered twice the killing power, but raw penetration was only part of the equation. The Mark III received something few other tanks in Korea possessed, a fully automatic 2-plane gun stabilisation system. This allowed the gunner to track targets and fire accurately while the tank was moving over rough terrain. Most tanks in the theatre, including American Shermans and Soviet-built T-3485s, lacked equivalent systems and typically had to stop or slow significantly to shoot accurately. The Centurion could keep moving and firing with precision. The ammunition loadout reflected the 20-pounder's versatility. The tank carried 65 rounds total, including armour-piercing ballistic capped rounds for standard anti-tank work, APDS discarding sabot rounds for defeating the heaviest armour, high explosive for bunkers and fortifications, smoke for screening, and canister shot packed with 580 steel pellets for close-range anti-infantry work. A trained crew could fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute thanks to the semi-automatic horizontal sliding breech. The tank weighed 49 long tons, roughly 50 metric tons. It carried a crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver. The turret front was cast armour 152mm thick. Hull sides measured 51mm, with removable armoured skirts for additional protection. The Rolls-Royce Meteor Mark IV-B engine, a 27-litre Vis-12 derived from the Merlin aircraft engine, produced 650 brake horsepower. Top speed on roads reached 21.5 miles per hour. The Centurion's one significant weakness was range. Internal fuel capacity of 121 imperial gallons gave it barely 65 miles on roads and half that cross-country. Fuel consumption ran approximately 3 to 4 gallons per mile off-road. The tank's weight also limited where it could be deployed, ruling out some bridges and softer ground. But in the confined valleys of Korea, where engagements happened at close range and resupply was never far away, these limitations proved manageable. When the Chinese Spring Offensive struck on April 22, 1951, the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group held a 12-mile front north of Seoul. This was a front suited for a division, not a brigade. Brigadier Tom Brodie had approximately 4,000 men to cover ground that doctrine said required 12,000. The terrain itself favoured the attacker. Steep ridges and narrow valleys channeled movement along predictable routes. Rice paddies on the valley floors turned to mud under rain. Defensive preparations were incomplete. No minefields had been laid. Wire obstacles were limited. And a critical gap existed at Gamak-san, Hill 675, the dominant terrain feature. This hill was left unoccupied. The Chinese would exploit it ruthlessly. The Chinese 63rd Army threw 3 full divisions at this single brigade. The 187th, 188th, and 189th Divisions totaled roughly 27,000 men in 27 battalions. Their objective was Seoul, and Commander Peng Dehuai had promised Mao Zedong they would capture it as a May Day gift. The brigade comprised the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel James Kahn, the 1st Battalion Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, the Belgian United Nations Command Battalion, and C Squadron of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars with their Centurion Mark IIIs. The Hussars were caught mid-rotation. A and B squadrons had already shipped to Japan. Only C Squadron remained, initially under Captain Peter Ormrod, a one-eyed veteran who had lost his right eye on D-Day while serving with the Scots Guards. The squadron fielded approximately 21 tanks named after British racehorses: Colombo, Korhu, Alicidon, Colorado. The first 2 nights of fighting pushed the brigade back from the Imjin River crossings. The Gloucesters, holding the western flank, were gradually surrounded on Hill 235. Chinese tactics deliberately exploited darkness to neutralize the advantages of UN air power and armor. The Centurions could not engage effectively at night. They lacked night vision equipment, and the Chinese knew it. By April 24th, the situation was desperate. The Gloucesters were cut off. A relief column assembled on Route 5Y, a narrow road running through steep gorges toward Hill 235. According to the QRH Museum's account, the force comprised 3 M24 Chaffee light tanks from the Philippine 10th Battalion Combat Team, leading 6 to 10 Centurions from C Squadron, followed by Filipino infantry and Gloucester rear echelon personnel. They reached within 2,000 yards of the besieged Gloucesters. Then the lead Chaffee was hit and knocked out, blocking the narrow road. 2 Centurions squeezed past the wreck, but the gorge ahead was too tight for further advance. Brigadier Brodie called off the attempt. The Gloucesters were on their own. Now, before we see how the final withdrawal unfolded, if you're finding this deep dive into British engineering interesting, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Now, back to the death ride of April 25th. Dawn brought mist coating the valley. At 0800 hours, US First Corps ordered Plan Golden A general withdrawal. Major Henry Huth, who had flown back from R&R in Japan the previous day to take command, split C Squadron into 2 groups. His tanks would cover the Fusiliers. Captain George Strachan's group would cover the Royal Ulster Rifles. What followed was, in Huth's own words recorded in his DSO citation, one long bloody ambush. The numbers involved are drawn from veteran testimony and unit citations rather than precise head counts, but accounts describe overwhelming Chinese strength at every turn. Captain Ormrod's force fought south along Route 11. At an S-curve, Ormrod spotted a prepared Chinese ambush and ordered his Centurions off-road through the rice paddies, firing as they charged past. His own tank slid into a drainage ditch. Chinese soldiers swarmed toward the stuck vehicle, while Ormrod fired his pistol from the turret until a grenade wounded him in the head. Sergeant Cadman, seeing enemy infantry battering at his turret hatches, drove his Centurions straight through the wall of a house to dislodge them, then ran over a machine gun position. Surviving accounts describe Chinese soldiers climbing onto moving tanks, trying to open hatches, attach sticky bombs, shoot through vision slits. The Hussars' response was brutal and effective. They turned their turrets toward each other and raked enemy soldiers off friendly hulls with Beezer machine gun fire. In one engagement documented in the war diaries, 3 platoons of Chinese appeared in what one tank commander described as parade ground order emerging from a riverbed. The Centurions destroyed them with some of the last ammunition they carried. Major Huth organized the final rearguard. According to his Distinguished Service Order citation, he repeatedly dismounted under fire to direct other tanks over difficult ground, and organised the collection of wounded onto tank rear decks. In the climactic action, Huth and Lieutenant Lindsay held off the Chinese advance with just 2 Centurions for what felt like an eternity, alternately leapfrogging backward under each other's covering fire. His citation describes how he and one other tank held back massed Chinese infantry and enabled the remaining forces to withdraw. The last shot, fired by Major Huth, ended the Battle of the Imjin River. The Gloucesters attempted a breakout that same night. Of approximately 750 men, only about 46 reached friendly lines under Captain Mike Harvey. Lieutenant Colonel Khan and 459 others were captured. Total brigade casualties reached 1,091, according to a cabinet memorandum dated June 26, 1951. But the brigade had achieved something extraordinary. They had delayed the Chinese 63rd Army for 4 days, throwing Peng's timetable 48 hours behind schedule. The QRH Museum's verdict is direct. Had it not been for the Centurions of the 8th Hussars, it is unlikely that the Belgians, Fusiliers or Ulsters could have been saved at all. The Centurion's dominance becomes clear when you examine its competition. The M4A3E8, Sherman Easy 8, still the most numerous UN tank with 679 deployed, carried a 76mm gun penetrating roughly 109mm at 1,000 metres. That was less than a third of the 20-pounder's APDS performance. The Sherman's hull armour measured approximately 64mm against the Centurion's 118mm glacis. The M26 Pershing offered better armour at 102mm hull front and a 90mm gun with roughly 200mm penetration, using HVAP ammunition, but the Pershing was chronically underpowered. The same 500 horsepower Ford GAA engine that powered the 10-ton lighter Sherman gave it a miserable 12 horsepower per ton ratio. Reliability and mobility problems led the US Army to replace M26s with M46 Pattons during 1951. The M46 Patton solved the engine problem with an 810 horsepower Continental power plant and was faster at 30 miles per hour, but it retained the 90mm gun without stabilization. Neither American tank could shoot accurately on the move. The T-3485, the standard Soviet medium tank used by Chinese and North Korean forces, was comprehensively outclassed. Its 85mm gun achieved roughly 100mm penetration at 1,000 yards. It could not reliably threaten the Centurion's frontal armour at combat ranges. The 20-pounder could destroy a T-3485 from virtually any angle at extreme range. One additional advantage proved critical in Korea's mountains. The Centurion's gun could depress -10 degrees, allowing crews to fight from hull-down positions on ridgelines while exposing minimal profile. The T-3485 managed only -5 degrees. No confirmed direct tank versus tank duels between Centurions and T-3485s occurred during the war. By the time the 8th Hussars arrived in November 1950, most North Korean armour had been destroyed. The first Centurion kill was actually a captured Cromwell, destroyed by Korhu at 3,000 yards on February 11, 1951. US General John O'Daniel, commanding 1st Corps, delivered the verdict that entered military history. In their Centurions, the 8th Hussars have evolved a new type of tank warfare. They taught us that anywhere a tank can go is tank country, even the tops of mountains. By early 1952, America was pressing Britain to supply Centurions to NATO allies under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, because M48 Patton production had not yet begun. A 1950 Swedish military assessment concluded that despite concerns about armour thickness, the Centurion was quite modern and the most cost-effective alternative with significant upgrade potential. Sweden tried to purchase Mark IIIs but was told Britain could not export them for 5 to 15 years due to British Army priority. That was not the reception for an obsolete design. Captain Ormrod's own assessment, recorded in his Imperial War Museum oral history, captures the tank's significance. At first, we thought the Centurions were going to be very difficult to use, but once our drivers and commanders had learnt how to overcome the paddy fields and the steep hillsides, they were magnificent at their cross-country role. The Centurion that emerged from Korea went on to serve with 14 nations across 40 years of combat. Israeli Shot variants, upgraded with the 105mm L7 gun, destroyed hundreds of Syrian and Egyptian tanks during the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War. At the Valley of Tears in October 1973, fewer than 100 Centurions of the Israeli 7th Armoured Brigade defeated approximately 500 Syrian T-55s and T-62s. Australian Centurions served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971, overcoming initial skepticism about heavy armour in jungle warfare. Over 3.5 years, 58 tanks served in country. 42 suffered battle damage with only 6 beyond repair and just 2 crewmen killed in action. Indian Centurions engaged Pakistani M47 and M48 patterns in the 1965 and 1971 wars, South African Oliphant variants, locally upgraded Centurions, destroyed 2 Angolan T-55s in a 9-minute engagement on November 9, 1987, the first South African tank combat since World War II. Total production reached 4,423 tanks across 13 basic marks. The design philosophy, a single universal tank combining heavy armour, a powerful gun, and reasonable mobility, effectively invented the main battle tank category that dominates armoured warfare today. Perhaps the most consequential legacy was not any single battle, but a single component. The 105mm L7 gun, created in 1954 by reboring the 20-pounder barrel after intelligence on the Soviet T-54 revealed the 84mm gun was inadequate, became the standard Western tank gun for a generation. It armed the American M60, the German Leopard 1, and tanks in Japan, India, and Israel. The Centurion arrived in Korea carrying the stigma of Britain's catastrophic World War II armour record. It left having proven that British engineers had finally solved what others could not, a tank that was more heavily armoured than American designs, more powerfully gunned than Soviet designs, and more accurately aimed than anything else on the battlefield. The men of C Squadron, 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, drove their Centurions through that 4-mile gauntlet because the tank gave them the protection, firepower, and mobility to survive what should have been a death sentence. 7 tanks lost in 3 hours sounds like a disaster, until you realise that those same tanks brought out most of an entire brigade. British engineering was not luck. It was 49 tons of steel, a stabilised 20-pounder gun, and 152mm of turret armour that worked when it mattered most. Korea showed how a balanced design combining protection, firepower, mobility, and fire control could dominate rugged battlefields. The Centurion's performance in 1951 helped shape the post-war main battle